Hello and welcome everyone. Thank you for being here. We're going to go ahead and get started. I'm Linda Hashef. I'm the Executive Director of Opportunity Alliance Nevada, and we really appreciate you joining us today and being part of the conversation. This will be the second panel in our series, and today we will be focusing on housing. We have a really great panel again today, and I'm sure we'll have a robust and interesting conversation. As Tracy mentioned, a few housekeeping rules. If you could just stay on mute, and if you have questions, please go ahead and put them in the chat box, and we'll get to them when we can. We'll get to them as we're talking. We have a very large number of attendees today, and I think that's a good thing, a really good sign. We appreciate you being here. Opportunity Alliance Nevada convened this forum to provide a space to examine and understand the impacts of the past and to discuss and explore opportunities for change and improvement going forward. And with that, I'd like to thank our sponsors who have supported us in this series: Charles Schwab Bank, US Bank, Wells Fargo Bank, JP Morgan Chase, the Estepona Group, and Vegas PBS. So with that, now I would like to introduce you to Alvin Odom, who will be providing a few remarks and some information. Alvin is a volunteer financial navigator for Opportunity Alliance, and he was one of the very first volunteers to sign to join our team, and he has rapidly become a large part of our leadership. He is also the senior manager of diverse markets at Charles Schwab Bank, located in Henderson, and he has been with them since 2017. His objective at Charles Schwab Bank is to increase awareness of and access to bank mortgage lending solutions among multicultural communities. And with that, I'd like to welcome Alvin.
All right, thank you so much, Linda. And first and foremost, I would like to read a statement prepared by Opportunity Alliance Nevada as it relates to this series, our Pathways to Racial Economic Justice series. So if you would please bear with me as I read the statement. Since our origin, our vision and mission has been to build financial stability and self-sufficiency for all Nevadans. We bring together resources and people from diverse socioeconomic backgrounds to investigate and understand barriers faced by those struggling economically, and we work to build pathways to solutions and self-sufficiency. With the recent national events related to racial injustice, we wanted to provide a forum to discuss pathways to racial economic justice. We stand in solidarity with the fight against systemic racial economic disparities and the historic financial oppression of people of color. We are inspired by so many people in our community who are using their voices and making change. We see you and are with you. Let's talk about it. This is intended to be an open and direct forum for all. The focus will be on financial and economic factors specifically, and we ask that the conversation remain respectful and thoughtful. We do not view ourselves as experts on the topic of racial economic disparities, so we have invited national, state, and local experts to lead this very important conversation. Today, we will discuss the role housing plays in building pathways to racial economic justice, and we're a very experienced, engaged, and passionate panel to help lead this conversation. So before I introduce the panel, I first want to share with you all, I'd like to say, visions or images that are informational. So with that said, thank you, Tracy, for teeing up those images. Look at these homes now, an entire block ruined by Negro invasion. Every house marked with an X now occupied by Negroes. Actual photograph of 4300 West Bell Place. Save your home, vote for segregation. This was a leaflet urging voters to adopt a referendum that prohibited African Americans from moving onto predominantly white blocks. And the next slide, Tracy. Detroit, 1941, the Federal Housing Administration required a developer to build a wall separating his whites-only project from nearby African-American residences. This tract is exclusive and restricted. The Veterans Administration subsidized the Sunkissed Gardens development in Southeast Los Angeles in 1950 for white veterans only. Miami, Florida, 1956. After Miami-Dade Mayor Chuck Hall sent the first wrecking ball to destroy an African-American neighborhood, buildings were demolished to make way for I-95 as children look on. Levittown, Pennsylvania, 1957. A crowd mobilizes before proceeding to harass the first African-American family to move into the all-white development. Plano, Texas, 2016. Attorney Elizabeth Julian successfully sued HUD and Dallas over intentional discrimination. A settlement enabled Bernstein Williams to move to the middle-class integrated neighborhood where she raised 2 college-bound children. So I'm real excited about this book that I just ordered. Those images come from a book called The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein. So if you want to learn more, feel free to purchase that book as well. So Tracy, thank you for putting up the presentation. We can hop out of the presentation. And again, I share those images in the spirit of, for those of you who attended the forum last week on wealth, we talk about history. And our friends at the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco, Ms. Jocelyn Cousins, I think she said it best. And in essence, Jocelyn said this: in order to determine the path forward, we have to look at historically how we got there. So I'm very excited for all of us to be educated today with a wonderful set of panelists. And if you would please just bear with me as I read through their bios. I think it's very worthy for you to know who they are and the experience that they have. So first and foremost, Ms. Peggy Bailey. Peggy Bailey is the Vice President for Housing Policy at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. In this capacity, she oversees the center's work to protect and expand access to affordable housing for people with low incomes. Throughout her career, she has helped build connections between the housing community and health, nutrition, child welfare, and other systems of care amid the growing recognition that access to stable, affordable housing is a necessary foundation that enables low-income people to meet other basic needs. Bailey holds a BA in government from the University of Notre Dame and a Master's of Public Affairs degree from the University of Texas at Dallas. Next, we have Nia Girma. Nia Girma Nia came to the Nevada Housing Division in 2017. She has a diverse professional history, including residential and commercial lending, personal and business insurance sales, public and private sector experience, and accounting. Ever detail-oriented and customer-minded, she has put her signature personal service and professional relationship building skills to work for employers like Wells Fargo, Wynn Resorts, and Allstate Insurance and their clients. Now comfortably at home at NHD, Nia is focused on educating home buyers, training lenders, and real estate professionals on home as possible programs. A Chicago native, Nia visited Las Vegas in the winter of 2003, and she never left. She is a graduate of Xavier University of Louisiana with a BS in psychology and a minor in biology. She's married with 2 young active boys, a baseball mom, and a traveling foodie. Next, we have Ms. Shanta Patton. Shanta is a broker salesperson at ERA Brokers Consolidated in Henderson, Nevada. Born into generations of homeowners, Shanta learned that homeownership was the key to generational wealth at an early age. She took those teachings and purchased her first home at 21 years of age. With over 16 years of experience, she has been trusted by many to handle their friends and families with the utmost care and professionalism. With the growth of online marketing and mobile-friendly technology, Shanta offers cutting-edge marketing strategies tailored to providing maximum online exposure to sellers. Shanta is also the 2020 Region 15 Vice President of the National Association of Real Estate Brokers. When Shanta is not working, she's with her 3 children. She's a lacrosse mom and enjoys great music and musicals. Next, Mr. Ben Slayton. Ben Slayton, a 54-year veteran of the mortgage industry, who has built several mortgage and mortgage-related companies and sold them to publicly traded companies. Today, Ben is the president and CEO of Legacy Home Loans, a mortgage banking firm whose mission is to increase the homeownership rate of Black Americans. Slayton was also the first Black realtor in America in 1964, the first Black owner-broker of a Century 21 franchise in 1968, the first of any race to be approved as a Freddie Mac multifamily plus seller servicer in the United States in 1986, and he's a member of the Panorama Mortgage Group, LLC, board of directors, which oversees 4 different mortgage brands. He's also the publisher and owner of the Mortgage Banker magazine, Mortgage Compliance magazine, and Mortgage Women magazine. Ms. Clay T. White. Clay T. D. White is the inaugural director of the Oral History Research Center for the University of Nevada, Las Vegas Libraries. She collects the history of Las Vegas and the surrounding area by gathering memories of events and experiences from longtime residents. Her projects include early healthcare in the city, history of the John S. Park neighborhood, the Boyer Early Las Vegas Oral History Project, and a study of musicians who played with some of the greats in the entertainment field. As one of 5 founders of the Las Vegas Black Historical Society, Incorporated, she chronicles the history of Las Vegas Black community that was established in 1905. White received her bachelor's degree from California State University, Los Angeles, master's degree in history from the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, and has completed work toward a doctorate at the College of William & Mary. White currently serves on the Board of Women of Diversity, the UNLV Presidential Debate Planning Committee, and the Historic Preservation Commission. Finally, now, I would like to introduce Kip Ortenberger, who is the host and moderator at Vegas PBS of Nevada Week Show. He has graciously agreed to be the moderator for our series. So finally, Kip, I will give you the floor.
Thank you, Alvin. I appreciate it. And definitely not finally, I think that intro and getting a pretty good contextual look at the history here. I noticed the dates 1916 to 2016. Very interesting. I think we're going to jump into history really, really quickly in this conversation, but I wanted to thank Opportunity Alliance in Nevada for hosting these. If you were not part of the first series, the format of these is going to look somewhat the same. So if you continue on the series, or if you're on the first one, hopefully it'll look somewhat consistent. We are going to talk a lot about historical perspective. We are going to delve into policy. We want to talk about solutions. The thing I wanted to stress on this forum more so than the last one too is because we have so many service providers here, we want to make sure that we are getting to the resources that are available for you, that you have a better understanding and knowledge of being able to direct some of your clients to the resources that we're talking about. With that said, a lot of you on the call right now know of those resources that we might not get to. So in our question and answer portion, if I could ask, if you have resources that you have identified related to what we're talking about, please make a note of those and log in or via the chat, tell us what those resources are so we can share them to the rest of the audience. I think that's really important. And as the series goes on, we want to do more and more of that. Let's get right into it. Back to Alvin's presentation there, 1960 to 2016. What I found interesting is the first picture you have of a predominantly white neighborhood trying to keep African Americans out. Fast forward to maybe the 70s. Clay T, you're going to be able to give a lot more perspective on this. I know we have block busting where we have the fear of African Americans moving in, devaluing properties, and then them being resold. Very interesting history altogether. Clay T, let's start with, we talked about this on the first series. How far back do we go? We're talking particularly about housing here. Let's use Las Vegas as an example. How far back in history do we need to go to really understand how policy has really influenced our housing gaps?
So we need to go back into history a lot farther than Las Vegas. Las Vegas started in 1905, but to talk about housing, we would have to go back until the end of the Civil War and look at what was happening at that time. But just to look locally, we can look as early in Las Vegas as 1930. 1931 is a good time frame to focus on in Las Vegas. We see people who everybody lived at one time in the downtown community, and that's old downtown near, what was the Lady Luck, that area of the city? Most of you might not know the Lady Luck, near the plaza. So that area of downtown was once completely integrated. Everybody lived in it. White people started moving toward the east in the beginning of their movement out of that area that became a business area. And those neighborhoods that they moved into and began to develop had restrictive covenants. African Americans could live in one place at that time as that movement happened, and they moved across the tracks into that West Side community. And just to give you another vivid example of what was happening in that early 1930 period, that was the building of the Hoover Dam, where the federal government comes into this area, builds a dam, but also build a city so that the workers on the dam could have a place to live. But Blacks were not allowed to live in Boulder City. So that just gives you an example of the early housing discrimination here in this local area.
Let's delve right into redlining is such a big part of this discussion. A lot of major cities were confronting this. Of course, Las Vegas was no different. Can you give us some context early on? And I don't want to just put this on Clay T. The rest of our panel can join in too. To give us a pretty good contextual idea of first off, how redlining originated and exactly what it was doing to segregate some of these communities.
So broadly, redlining is a way to deny mortgages to people of color. And we're just talking about Black people today. So that's how it begins. You deny mortgages, but banks in a majority of the large cities across the country, and almost any city we can name, actually had maps. And this book that was just mentioned that I am reading now actually has the communities with a red line drawn around it. So you could not loan in that community. That community was off limits. And if you were a white person, you had to be really careful not to be too close to that red lined area. We did not have a map of Las Vegas. We came on the scene a little later, and we were too small for this redlining activity to actually show up and have us put in a book like this that actually shows what happened here. But we know the West Side community, and we know how that community did not develop as other communities did. The housing from the beginning were shacks and tents for a very long time. And even though African Americans moved here, had good jobs in the beginning, especially during that World War II migration, in a lot of cases, you could see a shack or a tent with a Buick or a Cadillac parked in front of it because you could get a loan to buy a car because you were working, you had good credit, but you could not get a loan to buy a house. So that's what happened to that West Side community. And one of these days, any of you who would like to take a tour, I'll show you the results of that kind of thinking early on. And if anybody else want to talk about this on a national level, because—
Maybe I'll jump in on kind of a national level. It kind of goes back, as you were saying, you can take it all the way back 400 years, but I'll just deal with it within the last 100 years. And just a few years, in 1944, June 22nd, that was 17 days after I was born, President Roosevelt signed a bill called the Servicemen Readjustment Act of 1944, more commonly known as the GI Bill of Rights or the GI Bill. This bill provided veterans coming home from World War II an opportunity to get college education, technical and vocational training, loan guarantee for homes, for farms, for businesses, and unemployment insurance as well at $20 a week. This Prior to World War II, a college education and home ownership were mostly part of unreachable dreams for the average white Americans, not to mention Black Americans. Home ownership was mainly reserved for the rich. But however, the GI Bill changed all of that. By the time that the GI Bill ended, July 25th, 1956, 7.8 million of the 16 million World War II veterans had participated in a college education or technical or vocational training program. Millions took advantage of the GI Bill home loan guarantee program. From 1944 to 1952, the VA guaranteed $2.4 million home loans to World War II veterans. However, the VA did not administer the program itself. It only guaranteed the loans. So that left it up to the white owned banks, gave them free range to deny mortgages to Black people. Banks redlined poor neighborhoods, ensuring that the loans would be denied. In addition, builders who built homes in the suburbs built in the new home deeds a covenant that prohibited Blacks from buying homes in the suburbs. And as late as 1995, I personally purchased a home in Westchester, California, a very expensive home, where the deed still had the covenant stated in the deed that I could not occupy that home because I was not of the white race. Thank God that was abolished, but the language, even today, is still in the deed. You know, it takes, in the worst case example of segregation and bigotry that took place in the GI Bill by bankers. In 1947, in Mississippi, 13 Mississippi cities made more than 3,200 VA guaranteed loans, and only two, that's 2 of the 3,200 loans were made to Blacks. This practice was not confined to the South. Historian Katz Nelson said in New York and New Jersey suburbs, fewer than 100 Blacks out of 67,000 mortgages insured by the VA were made to non-white borrowers. You know, most of the schools provided technical and vocational training, were unable to participate. Blacks were not able to participate in the plumbing, electrical, printing, those kinds of trades that really helped build America. Only white students were able to attend, and they were also prohibited from, you know, going to those schools. So the white colleges would not accept Blacks, and most Blacks had menial jobs to support their families, and were unable to attend college. They were regulated to the small historical Black colleges who were underfunded, uncredited at that time, overwhelmed with massive influx of new students. And it's just, it was an amazing situation. I believe, because I happen to lived it, that the wealth gap in housing, as it continued to widen, continues to be the greatest instrument for widening and already a huge racial and wealth gap that created from the GI Bill.
Yeah, great point, Peggy. I want to bring you in on this conversation too. Let's talk more specifically about that wealth gap portion of this and how housing has affected that. Please comment on that.
Sure. So I think, you know, a key piece that we'll talk about the color. We'll all talk about the color of law. I think a lot over this time brings up points out is the role that these things didn't happen by happenstance, right? Actual policies and practices are what have caused the wealth gap. And so that means that there are things that we can do, or what we should be doing, to fix it, right? It's not a untractable problem if we turn our attention to it. The other thing is that all of this one of the ways that this has played out over time is to make it sound like it is inherently bad for Black and brown people to live next to each other, which is, again, not the case. It is this disinvestment in our communities that's caused the issues that exist in Black and brown communities, and a lack of overall investment, the intentional choices that were made that have caused that caused the issues that we live with. So one concrete example that I would say is happening right now, has come to light right now as COVID-19 has progressed across the country, and that's if you look at unemployment rates. And we have a chart, and I'll put a link to it in the chat here in a second, that shows Black unemployment rates since 1970 and white unemployment rates since 1970. And at Black unemployment rates at their lowest, which was just before the Great Recession, so 2007, early 2008, are barely as good as white unemployment rates at their worst. So that means that there's just this continued gap, no matter whether we're in an economic recession or whether we're in an economic boom, that there's this gap in unemployment rates. So if we're thinking about wealth, that means that Black people are not earning as much as white people. We don't have as consistency of employment. And the challenge is that the American dream that says that if you work hard and you go to school and you do these things and you'll be able to achieve it is not true for Black people, because at every income level and every education level, the gap between what the wage gap exists. And so I went to Notre Dame. Me as a Black woman, I have peers who had the same access to education as I did, who are making more, and unfortunately, that a lot of that is based on race. So what that means is that Black people are overrepresented among renters in this country, and Black people are also overrepresented as people who receive rental assistance. And one of the challenges in that is that if you're receiving rental assistance, which is great and it helps you stay housed, but as your income increases, your rent increases. So you can't ever save. It's difficult to save money, because unlike the rest of us who can save money as our income increases, they can't. There's programs within HUD that try to help correct for this, but by and large, that's an issue. And then you've got the other problem of so many people not getting rental assistance who need it, and the large number of people who are paying over 30, over 50% of their income on rent, which again makes it hard to save money. I think the last piece that we see is how communities of color in particular have to help family members because of this wealth gap generationally. Then then there's an expectation that if you do have resources, that you're going to help your family out or your friends out or extended networks out, and the degree to which if you are struggling financially, that you do have to rely on those folks. So it creates an added strain on Black families that white families don't experience at the same rates. So all of that then means that it's just a struggle to be able to get the Black families trying to take one step is equal to a white family taking 3 or 4 or 5 steps up the wealth chain.
And we're talking a lot about the wealth gap, of course, and affecting affordability of housing, whether it's rental or it's mortgage. I want to talk a little bit more, if I can, and Nia and Shanta, I want to bring you in on the conversation here. In addition to just the affordability, access and choice are two potential other barriers here. Of course, in Nevada, we have a supply and demand issue in addition to some of the racial wealth gaps that we're talking about. But then choice is a big one, I know, and a lot of determining factors in so many family-based things, education levels, income levels, depending on what neighborhood you live. I'm not the one to explain that. Nia, can you give us some more perspective there, please?
Absolutely. So with the Nevada Housing Division, what we began our mission with the inception of the Home is Possible program in 2014 was to make sure that we were able to provide self-sufficiency for families to achieve the goal of home ownership, one Nevada family at a time. That is still our goal. However, it is evolving because we've noticed in the past few years, the demographic of the users of our program don't necessarily represent the demographic of our state. For example, on a cumulative basis, approximately Nevadans make up about 8.9%, just shy of 9% of Nevadans are African American. However, about 6.7% of Nevadans that use our only 6.7% of African Americans use our program. We have systematically began to put areas in place to improve that and acknowledge that. First through, I believe, a three-step process. We outreach, education, and advocacy. Outreach first, what we had to identify that there were a lot of African Americans and the Latinx community as well who weren't necessarily aware that these programs existed. One of the biggest hurdles, however, is once they realize the program exists, we can go out to communities, which we've done pretty regularly pre-COVID, not just beyond our four walls. We like to go out to community centers and resource centers in all areas of some that Clay T referenced, on the west side, on the northwest side, on the east side as well, and make sure that the constituents there are aware of our programs. What we found, and one of the hurdles that we faced, is that even though they are aware of those programs, and even though these are working Nevadans who go to work every day and who have that slope that Peggy alluded to, is that they are able to pay their rent and they're working to pay their rent. However, the amount that they're paying on rent is usually 20 to 30% higher than those of white families. So it's hard to be able to save that money. Not only that, but establishing credit, because historically the things that African Americans spend their money on aren't necessarily reported evenly on a credit report. We don't usually see anything about rent on credit reports until someone has defaulted on their rent. So we don't have any way of keeping track of how well that their payment history is, if it's good. We don't have any way of keeping track on payment history of short-term lending and payday loans. We don't see any of those things or utilities on a credit report until someone has defaulted on them. So whereas a lot of our counterparts, our white counterparts in Nevada or across the country, are able to show the responsibility of good credit through car loans and through mortgages or small loans or student loans, we're not able to reflect that same sort of consistency and responsibility. So we've worked with a lot of partners, way too many to name, and I will put our email address in the chat line, but we do have preferred partners that we work with to help to educate the community about the importance of establishing credit and using your credit wisely so that you can qualify not only for a mortgage, but qualify for our programs. And then the last step that we sort of use to identify these hurdles, and we told a fine line because we give our lenders and our realtors the autonomy to represent their buyers and not necessarily involve ourselves in the lending process, but we do stand in the gap to advocate anytime that there's any sort of discrepancies in the practices of what any consumer brings to us about a lender. We refer them to other Nevada departments such as the mortgage lending division and things of that nature. One thing that we are able to do and make it even across the board is to sort of limit, we set the rates for our down payment assistance program, so it's not a predatory situation, but we have certainly recognized that even though we were making huge strides to be able to present our programs to all of Nevada, that there is a hurdle that African Americans face in being able to qualify for those programs.
Yes, thank you for that, and for highlighting how important education is here too, in addition to the navigation of the resources and connecting to resources too. Shanta, can you speak a little bit more about, I mean, we are talking about education side, understanding how the rules are played here. We're talking a lot about the lending side. We're talking a lot about how the wealth gap, of course, is affecting that too. But access to housing, is this just exacerbate the issue? We know that it's a problem here in our state in general. Is it then increasing the gap when we're talking about racial inequities in housing?
Hi, yes. You know, the best way that I can explain it is, it's almost, imagine if you played a game of Monopoly and your opponent had 400 times to go around the board before you were able to begin playing. You know, and so we're constantly playing a catch up that is almost impossible to win at. You know, and so when we look at national averages of Black homeownership, we see that we have had it increase. So think of it back in the 70s, we're at 41.6%. But then up in 2007, we went up to 46.5%, and then back down again. So currently in 2020, we're at 44%, and currently we're flat, but that's still up 3.4%. But then you think about our white counterparts, and their home ownership rate is well over 70%. So the gap is huge, and it requires us to put programs and resources together in order to do that. Some of the decline, especially here in Las Vegas, a lot of the struggle with home buyers of color is they were hit so hard during the recession, and purchasing a home, especially for the Black community, is such a personal thing. You know, it's where we bring our pride. It's the major contribution to our wealth. So for some to have lost that, it took a major hit for our community. You know, so we definitely see that we have yet to be able to recuperate from the recession. And as Nia was saying, them having the knowledge, a lot of the issues that we have is the lack of knowledge. So the lack of knowledge on the time frames after a foreclosure or a short sale that you can get back into the market. You know, the lack of knowledge of down payment assistance programs, the lack of knowledge on how to create, how to boost your credit scores without using some of these outside companies that charge $5,000 and $6,000 to do something that they could do themselves. So, and I think also the mindset. So having gone through something so damaging and embarrassing makes it where they have a fear of purchasing again. They don't want to do it. They would rather choose to rent than to ever deal with that again. You know, and so we have a few different hurdles that we have to get through, you know, to get them back on track. And so one of the things that NAREB does nationwide is we have our community wealth building days, and we've partnered with the state and some of the local down payment assistance companies as well. And we go in and we teach them how to advocate for themselves, how to read your closing statement, how to read your credit report, how to fix things on your credit report, loan programs, things to look for. We bring in panels of the down payment assistance program so they can go over the requirements of each one of them. And also when it comes to the gap, I think it also has to do with what is available in their price range. And so they might be able to rent in Summerlin, you know, and that's where they prefer to go because of schools, you know, safety, whatever that might be. But then when we take them into home ownership, we're having to convince them that owning a home makes sense, but they might not actually be able to live in Summerlin. They might have to get a home further east, you know, or further north. And so being able to do that also means, how do we address the school situation? Not all schools are created the same. And so some of the reasons they maybe wanted their child to be able to go to Palo Verde instead of Mojave, you know, and so those are some of the things that we have to address too, because those are great concerns for parents when they're thinking about this. And so when you have to weigh safety sometimes in school situations as opposed to owning, they don't necessarily always see the benefit of it, you know. And I think that we are making progress, because as much as more charter schools become available in areas, it allows them to stay in these areas but still be able to know that they can give a good education for their kids as well. You So we have a lot of different challenges, and that's why it takes organizations to really get down into the community and try to figure out what the best way is. And it also takes a lot of allies and partnerships. One of the things that NAREB does is we have a civic engagement committee, and our civic engagement committee goes out and creates relationships with sororities and churches and try to bring the knowledge directly to where people are most comfortable being. So it's a troubling thing, but it's definitely something that we can't lose sight of, because in order for us to move forward, we have a long way to go. And like I said, if someone has had 400 opportunities to go around the board and accumulate wealth and property, and you just get to the board, it's almost an impossible feat to even be close to winning.
Yeah, so many times around the board, and as you mentioned, so many variables here in the neighborhood that you are buying a home in that are very, very important choices here. Education, you mentioned. Again, when we're talking about much broader issues here, we're talking about closing the wealth gap, when you can see how interdependent, interlinked all these things are. I want to bring it back, and Alvin, I want to bring you into the discussion if I could. I want to bring it back just to home ownership first. I want to talk about rental, then after that, Peggy, a little bit. But home ownership, can you give us some context on when we're talking about this wealth gap? Fill in the blank almost, Alvin. A home ownership, owning a home for an African-American family, for a Hispanic family, means what in closing the wealth gap? You give us some context there.
Yeah, I think the perspective that I'll offer is one that I heard before when it comes to the cycle of legacy. And we think about home ownership, and everyone on the panel has kind of touched on this and how everything is interrelated. But when you have home ownership in the African American community or in any community, then effectively you have funding for your schools. Then when you have funding for your schools, and then you have, generally speaking, quality education for your kids. And when your kids receive a quality education, that increases their earning potential. And when they increase their earning potential, it gives them the ability to then buy a home, so their kids can have quality education. And that quality education will go to the earning potential for them. And that gives them the ability to buy a home for their children's children. And so when we think about the importance of home ownership, I kind of put in that perspective of the cycle of legacy, and really home ownership being at the center of that, as everyone said, because it ties into the education, it ties into the quality of education, and also ties into, generally speaking, our earning potential. And that cycle is such a vicious cycle when it never begins. And it's a hard one to break as well. So I hope that kind of puts into perspective, Kit, in terms of the importance of home ownership, and specifically for communities of color.
It does. And now let's flip, Peggy, to the rental side of this. And unfortunately, I want to focus on the negatives here. When you are housing insecure and potentially cannot afford rent, you get into those types of cycles where transiency becomes a big issue. And I bring this up because this is a big problem here in Southern Nevada itself, as we have a huge transient population of especially persons of color renting and moving around the valley to find affordable housing, to find accessible housing. You give us some context on how that affects a family of color.
So one of the things that we don't talk enough about is the traumatic stress that's caused for low-income families and when they're unstably housed. What does that mental burden do to a mom with 2 kids who doesn't know for sure if the police are going to come that day to evict her out of her home, and is struggling with multiple jobs to be able to try to afford that spot? I mean, that's what I talked about a little bit before, is there, the gap between incomes for low income people and rent costs keeps increasing. Incomes have been staying stagnant even as the economy was going up pre-COVID, but rents were going up at really high rates. And so we know that multiple moves hurts kids in school. Even if, during the school year, a child is supposed to be able to stay in that school district, but you don't know how far it's going to be to get to school, whether kids can do their homework. It hurts if you're trying to find a place to live and you're having to do it quickly, you may not be able to find a place that's the healthiest place to live from an environmental toxins standpoint. And those and for adults, moving also impacts work. If you can't just take off work in order to move again and again and again, and that can hurt people's ability to stay stable in their job as well. What we say in the housing space, right, is that housing is the foundation for all other things, and unfortunately, we don't treat it that way when we're talking about safety net programs. Medicaid, to the degree that you're eligible, is an entitlement program. Food is an entitlement program, but housing is not. And so that means we have almost 12 million renters who are paying more than 50% of their income on rent. And that's just not sustainable. So that's the other piece that housing affordability from a rental standpoint is a burden, because if you're paying most of your income on rent, that means you don't have money for other things, like not only just basic needs like food, healthcare, prescription medicine, but those extra things that fill out our lives. You don't have money for your kid to join a football league. You don't have money to join right now, right? In order for kids to go swimming, you've got to be able to pay for that and have internet access and all of these things that if you're paying upwards of 50% or more of your income on rent, you can't do those things. And so, then the conversation about saving money seems like a complete pipe dream that you're never going to be able to get off of that treadmill. And I really love the analogy, a love in the pain that it causes analogy that Shanta has said about going around the Monopoly board 400 times and now you're just starting. I mean, that's the way someone, putting that in personal terms of just this race, it's exhausting for families, and that bleeds over into every part of their lives.
Absolutely. And if I were to use that analogy, 400 times around means I'm landing on chance and other things with the bad luck of losing all my money prior to even getting to that those 400 loops. So very, very good point. I want to come back, Clay T, and talk a little bit more about the historical perspective here. We talked about some of the more explicit policy making, redlining, of course, the top of that list. The GI Bill, as Ben had mentioned, we talked about on the previous show too. Well, let's maybe fast forward to maybe the last 25 years or so of our history. Are we seeing more implicit forms of policy making that are happening at the local, state, or federal level that are still affecting housing, rental, or home ownership in a city like Las Vegas?
So in a city like Las Vegas, we see areas where home ownership is very vibrant among Blacks, but there is always a segment of the population, and sometimes a healthy segment of the population, because of unemployment, because of mental illness, because of you lose your home and then you're in transitional housing and you can't get out of that cycle. So there are many obstacles in the African American community when it comes to housing and wealth and what's going on in Las Vegas today. We see a homeless population surrounding the West Side community. There is the Mission on the corner of D and Bonanza. If you go over to Main Street, you see Catholic Charities and the Salvation Army. Unfortunately, all those corridors of homelessness surround the African American community. So it means when I drive into the community that because African American homeless people have nowhere to go, and all the homeless in the county have nowhere to go, they are right on the sidewalks surrounding the livable areas of the African American communities. If we look back to the mid 1950s, after the migration had taken place, the World War II migration, the city did not expect African Americans to continue to live here. They thought that after the jobs ended, the World War II jobs ended, most African Americans would leave. It did not happen. So the infrastructure of the African American community was never up to par with other communities. So in the 50s, you began to see sewage lines put in, electricity, and some other amenities, sidewalks, street lights, those kinds of things. I'm not saying that we didn't have electricity in the houses there, but street lights. So those weren't put in until the 50s. When a person doesn't have the training necessary for the jobs that are available in an area, which is what happened here, so then we get a revolution or a riot, what is called a riot in 1969, because we didn't have those jobs available. So the community was just completely frustrated. So it wasn't until 1971, after that 1969 riot, that we then had something called a consent decree. That legal document then demanded a percentage, 12%, because that's what the population was of Blacks in Las Vegas at the time, 12% of the jobs in a whole variety of categories finally opened up to African Americans on the Las Vegas Strip, where most of the jobs were at the time. So that gives you a picture of what was happening. And then those jobs, the promotions on those jobs weren't the same as promoting a white person in some of those jobs. So I know I've gone beyond your question or around your question, but that is a picture of what happened in Las Vegas with jobs and homelessness and housing. So we had a community built in 1955 called Berkeley Square. And you see some other houses also on the west side, west of J Street, built about the same time. If you drive around those communities, you will see some of the middle-class African Americans were able to move into those communities. At that time, FHA loans became available. So you see some stable parts of the community as well, but some very, very unstable parts that then bleed over into all of the other categories that we're talking about today.
Could I add one thing?
Yes.
Too, on the homelessness and the rent piece too, on what things that we see, you know, on the homelessness piece, it hurt, you know, I have friends that live in Las Vegas, and it really, I want to, you know, there's a lot that the community is going to have to do to overcome the pictures that we saw at the beginning of COVID of the parking lots that were painted where people were living, that, you know, people were expected to sleep on parking lots and in boxes, and how horrific that looked. And I just, you know, I hope all of us are working all the time to be able to make sure that that's not thought of as taking care of people, but it shows a little window into what we've done for with people who are experiencing homelessness, and how, you know, this conversation of directing resources to people, to that group of people in particular is important, because across the country, 40% of those who experience homelessness are Black. And that is just completely unacceptable. And it's just, the fact that we've started to learn these statistics over the last 5 or so years, and we aren't screaming and it's not making us cry every day is appalling, and we've got to do better when it comes to that. I think also, you know, what happens too with when things are racialized that way is a lot of the practices that we use to help people get out of homelessness are really paternalistic, because we think people don't know how to behave. And so we say that, oh, well, if you do all these behavior change things, then that's what's going to get you into housing and help you succeed. When we need to stop and take people for who they are and help them get housed first, and then wrap supports around them when they're stable and safe, and help them make the choices in their own lives about what is next. And then on the rental side, we have to remember that there are still things today that we do that are discriminatory. And one of them is discriminating people based on what they're using to pay for rent. So we call that source of income discrimination, where, you know, if someone's getting a Social Security check, or in this case, getting a housing choice voucher, that landlords there isn't a federal protection against you can't put in the paper, won't take voucher holder, but there are lots of other things that you can do. Well, and in some places actually still do that, say we're not going to take voucher holders. And there's not a federal protection against against that kind of discrimination. So that's something that states and localities can do, but that we're also pushing at the federal level to make sure that landlords can't discriminate against people based on the income they're using to pay their rent.
Excuse me, Kip. Thank you, Peggy. We do have a question. Would you like to address it now or wait until the end?
Let's address it now. Sure.
Sure. So Ruben asks, what are ways as a landlord to help the community of color gain equity?
Great question, Peggy. I think you'd probably be the expert on this since it's more on the rental side.
Sure. So, well, one way, you know, it depends on what, you know, in trying to think about the role of landlords in this. Obviously, we want you know, landlords who aren't discriminating against people based on the income that they're using. You know, you know, that landlord-tenant relationship is really precarious, and we don't want landlords to overstretch what they're doing. But, you know, maybe not charging late fees for missed rent. You know, because if they couldn't pay their rent, then how are they going to supposed to pay the rent and the late fees? Punitive policies like that, things like that. Also, there's a lot that landlords can do right now to help educate tenants on the things that they're eligible for to help them pay their rent. There in the last few bills that have been passed by Congress, there's grant dollars that have gone to the city and counties and states that people can tap into to help pay their rent. So in a time like this, it's not so much about gaining equity, but it is about how to help people not get behind and owe landlords more than what they need to owe. And how do we help people pay their rent? I think the last thing I would mention, though, for housing agencies, and I don't know if in Las Vegas they have this, but there are housing agencies around the country that can operate what's called the Family Self-Sufficiency Program. It's a program within HUD where, so as I described before, when you have rental assistance, if your income goes up, your rent goes up, because you're always going to pay you're always going to pay 30% of your income toward rent. So if your income goes up, then you're going to pay a little bit more in rent. Well, a housing authority that participates in the Family Self-Sufficiency Program will take that increased rent that you're paying and can put it in an equity account for you, and we'll work with you on how to keep increasing your income and keep donating, keep putting resources into that equity account. Meanwhile, the housing agency is paying that increase in rent as it goes up. And then after you have achieved your goals, after about 5 years, usually, you have access to that equity account. You can also use that equity account along the way to do things that help you keep your job. So that's not a landlord, but it is the housing agency that's delivering that's giving rental assistance, that's helping families figure out a way to build savings. And we found that after 5 years, families that participate in that program typically save about $6,000, which, you know, is a good amount of money to be able to move forward on some of the other strategies around home ownership and things like that.
And Nia, I know just mentioned that the Southern Nevada Housing Authority has a similar program to that. I want to talk more, bring it back to the homeowner side of this, and also back to the previous conversation we had last week. We ended that conversation talking about a lot about COVID and how COVID is not only exposing some of these gaps, but exacerbating them. Of course, housing is no different here. And as COVID continues, we're going to see more and more housing issues, both on the rental side and the lending side. Ben, Nia, Shanta, all of you, big ticket policy here. Is there opportunities, do you think, on the lending side, specifically the home ownership side, where we might be able to see, we have a window of opportunity to see some big policy come through? And if so, what could that policy be? Shanta, I'll start with you.
So some of the policies that we are working on specifically for COVID is we're mainly focused on the impact of the mortgage industry when it comes to holding lenders accountable and servicers accountable for these forbearances that they're supposed to be giving out, and making sure that they are doing their part and that they're clear about it and being transparent with the homeowners, especially when it comes to repayments. Because what we don't want is to get into a position later on where they're going into foreclosure because they thought it was this and it was really a balloon payment, or they thought it was going to be tapped onto the end of the mortgage, but it was really only a 6 months forbearance where they were going to have to get caught up in 6 months. So we're really looking on the transparency of that, as well as our concern for gig jobs and for people who typically were Uber and Lyft and some of those other jobs that they were using, and whether or not they'll be able to get that income back, because quite a few of them were using that in order to qualify for homes. And then I just wanted to throw in a couple things that NAREB has been doing to increase home ownership. So some of the major things is, one, we have a goal of 2 million new Black homeowners in the next 5 years. And we've been working on that and getting towards that. And we like to think that we've done our part towards raising Black homeownership up to this 44% as well. But some of the things that we have is we want to address millennials. And so we have a program called House Then the Car, and it focuses on the 1.7 million millennials who earn over 100,000 that are mortgage ready, but they're choosing to rent. They're also choosing to get large mortgage or large car payments before they even have a mortgage. And so we are focusing on bringing education to millennials specifically to educate them on the benefits of home ownership, on how they can use their equity to finance kind of some of the lifestyle that they like to use, but that they're building equity. Some of the other things we see with millennials is they're less likely to want to buy a house, but they're extremely interested in investing in property, especially multiplexes. So they want to live in something, you know, maybe urban that's right near everything, but they don't want to own it, and or they can't afford to own it, but they're more interested in investment. So we're focusing our program, and we have a website, housethenthecar.com, but that's one of the 8 initiatives that NAREB has under our current president to be able to focus on minorities. The other thing that we have is a credit restoration and maintenance. We constantly have in our community a credit issue. And so in addition to the credit issue, we have a program that we partner up with D-Free, and it is a free national program, and we work as a group. So all of us are in it, and we focus specifically on getting debt-free. So getting rid of the bad debt and accumulating some good assets. And so it's a national program. Anyone can join. It's free. We don't have access to anyone's information. It's a portal. They go in, they put their goals in. It lays out a plan on how you're able to get there, you know, and what you need to do. And then it helps monitor what you're doing, remind you, and you'll continue to go in there and update your progress. but we're trying to get people to the point of being able to cut the debt so that they can begin to save on that. So those are some of the things. One thing I will tell you about NAREB's history and why we're here is we were founded in 1947. And the reason why we were founded is because at the time, African Americans could not be realtors. We were not allowed to be a part of the National Association of Realtors. And at the time, the Realtor Association was not backing fair housing. They were on the opposite side. They didn't want the integration. They wanted the redlining. They were the ones responsible for block busting. And so they were opposed to those things. So as a community or as an organization, we took a stance and created our own association. And so now we have 90 chapters over the country. And actually our president was testifying in front of Congress this morning. And so we were very pivotal when it came to fair housing. And we have our policy positions on our website, which is NAREB.com, NAREB.com. And you can go in and see some of our policy positions, specifically our position on the HUD Section 184, as well as a possible bill coming out from Congressman Meek. And that is a savings program similar to a 529 educational plan that would allow you to save specifically for home ownership. So we have quite a bit of policy positions. Yearly, we come out with a report called SHEBA, the State of Housing in Black America. And that's also on our website. And we track the numbers of home ownership and we track the progress as we continue to go through the years. And then we will know where we need to put our focus in. Based on the based on the current NAR policy or numbers, they have 1.4 million real estate agents, and out of the 1.4 million, less than 5% of them are African Americans. So typically we know that people like to do business with somebody that they can relate to. And so one of the things that we're focusing on as well is scholarship programs that would allow minorities to get into real estate, and we will help to fund that process. And even though we're not realtors, not all of us are realtors and some of us are both, we are working to sponsor their realtor membership dues as well so that they have access to MLS and that we set them up. We're also focusing on getting more real estate agents into commercial real estate because we hold less than 4% of the share as far as real estate agents, Black real estate agents in commercial. So when we think about the disparities of it, you know, even during this time from 1947 to even 2007, 74% of realtors were white. And so there's still a large gap. There's a gap in loan officers that are Black. So we can gain all this momentum with home ownership, but we're also underrepresented in the group of people who are meant to be there to assist them. So we have so many facets of what we have to work on to be able to get where we need. Same way with housing, and you know, we've got to think about school and neighborhoods and safety. It's the same way when it comes to real estate, is how to get more people into real estate. And unfortunately, the NAR numbers also show that 48% of Black realtors are only part-time real estate agents, 48%. So we have to get them to the point where they can make this a full-time position as well, so that they're able to assist with other buyers as well and sellers. So some of the things in that NAREB 8, and then I'll give it back over to you, is our house then a car for our focus on millennials. We have our credit restoration and maintenance that goes over how to create business credit, as well as a part of the D-Free, which is how to get out of debt and work on your credit. We have Rosie, which is our Realtors Opportunities for Seasoned Individuals. That's when we go into the community. And for some of our over 40 community members, we talk about life insurance and health insurance, reverse mortgages, which is always a hot topic, retirement. And then we have our civic engagement, where we work with churches and other allies out there to try to bring as much information to it as we possibly can. So we've been here since 1947. We're going strong. As regional vice president, I'm in charge of all chapters west of Colorado and And we have been pushing quite a bit in order to make sure that we're doing our part to increase homeownership.
Shanta, thank you for all those resources. It's amazing. You can find those on the website, as you mentioned. We did have a really quick chat. How do you become part of some of the initiatives you're talking about, especially in the policy end? Is it easy to become a member of NAREB?
It's absolutely easy to become a member. So if you're in Las Vegas, all you need to do is go to NAREBLV at gmail or NAREBLV.org. And if you're in another part of the country, you're going to go to NAREB.com and it will connect you with a chapter within your area. But also you'll want to check out NAREB.com, look under who we are. There's a 13-minute history video in there, and it talks about how we got here and the different things that we've been a part of. But you can also see our Sheba report and our current policy positions.
Thank you. Ben, I want to bring you in the conversation here, and I want to do double duty. We have a question I think you can answer too. I would like you to talk about Legacy Home Loans Organization, especially why it's needed today. I think it's relevant to this question. The question is, how much do gender inequalities magnify the racial housing bias, such as with loans? And Ben, you're on mute.
I don't think that there's been that much change over the years. Discrimination still takes place in the underwriting process, the origination process. And the reason that I started Legacy was because I felt, I had been very successful in the real estate business over the years, and I wanted to do something different and leave a legacy for my people. And I decided that we needed to be able to build a nationwide mortgage banking company that was totally focused on the home ownership or increasing the home ownership of African Americans. And that's what we've done. We have branch offices across the country, some in Atlanta, some in Dallas, Houston, Chicago, Las Vegas, and other parts of the country. But the problem is, and just to kind of maybe take a step back, you had mentioned about COVID. One of the things about COVID is that a lot of education needs to take place. And as Shanta also said, that people are being told that they can go out and just stop making payments because of COVID, and not knowing what each individual lender requires as far as their forbearance policy. We try to tell our clients that it's best if you can make the payment, make the payment, and do not go into a forbearance, because if it's difficult to make that one payment and you allow 2 or 3 payments to go by, some investors and lenders will not put that amount on the back end of the loan, and you'll have to continue. You have to figure out how you're going to make those payments. So we've been trying to do that and try to convince our clients that they need to continue to make their payments the best that they can. We can't do this by ourselves, no matter what. I don't care how big I build Legacy, we can't do it alone. And it's like a lady that ran for president once said, it takes a village. And it's going to take a village of lenders to agree. For instance, one of the programs that I'm working on is, let's just use a lender. I don't choose to use a name, but one of the largest lenders in the country. Let's say that they made $350 million worth of loans to African Americans. And then when you multiply that times the number of lenders throughout the country, if only 25% of those lenders agreed to increase whatever it took to for advertisement or to do whatever they needed to do to increase their loans to African Americans by 10%, compounded over 5 years, our 44% would immediately go from 44 to somewhere in the 60s. And that's what it's going to take. It's going to take a whole village of lenders and investors that can see what the problem is and identify with it. One of the best things, I mean, I never participated in the marches and the civil rights movements that went on, although I did benefit from it. But it's going, and it's amazing to see today how diverse the groups are that are out marching and trying to make a difference. But until our lenders begin to take on the responsibility of saying, Black people did and have been receiving a bad deal, and we're going to make a difference. We're going to increase our lending to Black Americans. That's when it's going to make a difference.
Ben, I'm interested. Just is this just political will we're talking about? I mean, is this more just the lending sector itself needs to find more? Is there a financial benefit to this that that there's a way of maybe coalescing this? You give us some ideas of maybe how we can move towards making big change in lending, like you're speaking of.
Well, it comes from the top. Nothing's going to happen until the CEOs of these mortgage operations and banks decide that we're right, that it's not right for Blacks to have a 44% home ownership rate, and whites have 70, 72, 73% home ownership rate, and wants to do something about it. And the only way that they can do that is to put some money up to for advertisement to convince Black people that they want to do business with them, and that they'll make loans to them, and they will make loans as equally as they would to anyone else. So it's a matter of determination that what has been going on and what has happened is wrong, and they want to correct it. I mean, I've been in this business 54 years, and I have seen that I have seen a lot of change, but I haven't seen enough change. And I've spoken to realtors when I first became the first Black realtor in America. I used to give talks to realtors telling them that they were responsible for not showing homes in certain areas. They were responsible, just like the banks and the lenders were, and that they need to decide that they're going to make a difference.
I just want to ask, do we have any questions? Anybody raising a hand that wants to call in or unmute and ask a question?
We do have a question about HOA discrimination and harassment.
Yeah, Nia, maybe this is a question for you. Resources around that. If you're dealing with HOA discrimination or harassment, legal, potentially other intervention measures.
Absolutely. So though that's not actually the work of the Nevada Housing Division, geographically pre-COVID, we share a wall with the Ombudsman's Office for HOA here for the state. And they have a really great resource tool, and I'm sure I will get some information and be able to share it with the group. I'm sure that they are doing something virtually, but they do have an open forum to the public each month just to let participants and let constituents know about their rights as a paying HOA member. And then they also have forms and actions that you can take if you feel that you have been a victim of discrimination. I would like to say, as far as one thing that the state of Nevada, the Business and Industry Department does is not only talk the talk, but walk the walk. So we do the representation matters. So the majority of the ombudsman's office is a very diverse group. And they take those matters pretty seriously. So I can get his information and his and share that with the group in here in just a second. Oh, I think you're muted.
Sorry, thank you. If we don't have any more questions, we only have a few minutes left. I was hoping we could go around to each panelist. And again, we have a very diverse audience here, a lot of service providers, but that's not all we have. We have a lot of nonprofit leaders, public elected officials as well. But thinking of just everything we've talked about here, Clay T, we'll start with you since we started with you talking about the historical aspect. Just give us one takeaway that is really important for our audience to take away from our conversation today.
So I think the most important takeaway today is that systemic racism affects the entire life cycle of African Americans. No matter what system in the country you think about, it affects us. Healthcare, and I can name every system. So someone said something about we can't do it all by ourselves, that we have to have partners and allies and friends and all of that. And we do need all of that, but this has to change now. We can't go another 50 years and say, okay, let's try it again. This has to stop now.
Shanta?
I think mostly get the debt down, join the free D-Free challenge. Let us help you. Get educated. Don't just assume what you see online is correct, what your friend's sister told you. There are programs out there. If you've had a foreclosure or short sale, you are not out of the game. You can hop back in, and we're here. We're a nonprofit, and we are here to assist you. So just let us know how we can help you.
Alvin, how about you?
I would say just to offer some perspective, and for the folks on this call who are in leadership positions in the organization or within their community, is think about the distinction between equality and equity. When you start thinking about the distinction between equality and equity, think of equity in terms of outcomes and establish those equitable outcomes that you are trying to reach, and realize that there is a responsibility in order for you to reach those equitable outcomes to input inequitable inputs. It would take more for you to increase African American homeownership, to decrease homelessness. It would take inequitable inputs for you to arrive at an equitable outcome, whatever that may be in your organization. So just consider that when you're thinking about equality versus equity. It's really about outcomes, not so much giving everyone the same amount.
Peggy, how about you?
I think what I'd leave with is the slogan, be the change, right? Think about the things that are under your control and change those things. One of the things that I've been trying to help my team and all of us here at the center work on is that, you know, sometimes we get lost in the bigger issues that need to be addressed and forget about the things that we have control over. And so those things that may have nagged you before or you sort of noticed before, now is the time to fix those things.
And Ben, how about you?
Yes, you know, I think we all have missions, and we're all very passionate about our missions. My mission is increasing Black home ownership. You know, it's a known fact that home ownership helps people get higher education. People who own their own homes are likely to participate in civic activities more so than others. People who own their own homes are physically healthier than those that are not homeowners. Communities where there's a higher home ownership rate, there is a lower crime rate. There are few people on public assistance in communities where there's homeownership. Property maintenance of homes. People take better care of their homes if they actually own it. Homeownership gives families backyards for their kids to play in a safe backyard. Homeownership stabilizes families, it stabilizes communities. It's something that everyone should want to work toward in helping to achieve these goals for African Americans. And you know, if we work together, if it's good for African Americans, it's good for white Americans. So it all works out well, but we have to figure out how we're going to work together as a village.
And Nia, why don't you bring us home?
Thank you. Well, to piggyback off what Ben said, our goal is certainly establishing home ownership for all Nevadas, and specifically, I'm passionate about establishing home ownership for African Americans here in Nevada. One of the most important things, and I've enjoyed not only participating in this panel, but even watching the last discussion, is that sometimes it can seem overwhelming. It's a lot of information and a lot of negative information. We have to sort of arm ourselves with that information about historically the policies and the things that have led us to be where we are, but not to be discouraged. I always say that a true measure of success is not what you've achieved, but what you've helped someone else achieve. So if you have put yourself in a position to own a home or know any information about advocacy or education, then it is your duty to reach back and help someone who doesn't quite have the same access to information as you are. You are not successful until everyone around you has achieved that same level of success.
Wonderful points. Thank you, Peggy, Clay T, Ben, Shanta, Alvin, Nia. Thank you so much. I really appreciate all of you and what you have contributed to this. I'm going to kick it over to Linda for final closing comments.
Thank you, Kip. Thank you for moderating this important discussion. And thank you to our panelists for your valuable input and perspective and sharing of your experiences. Another big thank you goes out to all the attendees that joined us today. If you haven't signed up for the next panel, it is on health, which some of our panelists here today touched on. And we have several other panel series coming up. So we encourage you to sign up, and we will also be sending out a post-event survey that we would really appreciate you filling out and sending back. I know everybody's really busy. So thank you again for being with us today, and we look forward to seeing you next week, and stay well. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks.